Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The horrifying execution of Oliver Cromwell's remains. One of the most controversial figures in English history is Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell would spectacularly defeat the English king and his army during the English Civil War, and he was a leading figure advocating for the trial of Charles I and his subsequent execution. Following the king's execution, Cromwell was offered the crown and to become king, but he debated this for 6 months and instead took the title of the Lord Protector. He saw himself as a watchman, to keep an eye over the nation, but he then rampaged throughout Ireland, and his army committed scores of atrocities and killings. Cromwell also imposed Puritan rules and laws on the country, meaning that life became rather restricted across the lands. It wasn't long before the experiment in England without a monarch was over, following the restoration of the monarchy, when Charles II, the son of the executed king, was invited to come onto the throne. But in those years, Cromwell had died, but Charles sought to impose strict and harsh discipline and punishment on those men who were responsible for his father's brutal execution. He ordered a series of trials and executions, but he wanted Cromwell to suffer, despite the fact he had already been dead a number of years. His body was unceremoniously dug up before it was paraded throughout London and was then executed. But what is the bloody story of this? Oliver Cromwell suffered towards the end of his life with malaria and kidney stones, and in 1658 he became very ill with malaria fever. He ignored the treatments for it, as it was discovered by Catholics, and with this he became further ill. He was succumbing to his illness rather quickly, and also his daughter died during this time. But at Whitehall, on the 3rd of September 1658, at the age of 59, Cromwell died. The news of his death was greeted by a huge storm that hit England and Europe, and it's believed it was sepsis that caused his death. He was given a huge funeral, one fit for a king, and this took place at Westminster Abbey. The funeral took inspiration from that of James I's funeral procession, and inside the abbey he was buried and interred. It was believed by those who were there that he would be laid to rest amongst kings and queens for centuries, but Cromwell's remains would not be left undisturbed. It was his son Richard who succeeded him as Lord Protector, and he had little power in Parliament or the army, and was quickly forced to resign, and then Parliament turned to reinstating a constitutional monarch, and they invited Charles II back from exile in 1660 to be the king. Cromwell's body was undisturbed inside of the abbey until the restoration of the monarchy. Charles ordered many trials to bring those who signed his father's death warrant to justice. He wanted them punishing, and 12 surviving regicides who took part in the trial and execution were hanged, drawn and quartered. They were took through the streets to a place of execution until they were brutally executed in front of a huge crowd. But a recalled Parliament wanted to go further and wanted to bring the death sentences even to the dead, as 3 important and significant players in the Civil War had died in the years after Charles I's execution. Because of this, Parliament ordered the posthumous execution of Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, John Bradshaw, the judge at the king's trial, and Oliver Cromwell. They were to be subjected to a traitor's death, despite already being dead. Cromwell's body was hidden inside the wall of the middle aisle of the Henry VII's Lady Chapel, inside of Westminster Abbey, and it took a while to exhume the remains. The wood and cloth were tricky to move, and it was difficult to remove his remains from where they were placed, but eventually this was freed, and on the 28th of January 1661, the bodies of Cromwell and Henry Ireton were taken to Holborn, and specifically the Red Lion Inn. The bodies were held there for a night until John Bradshaw's joined them. They were then, on the morning of the 30th of January 1661, subjected to their ordeal. The coffins were opened, and the shrouded bodies of the dead regicides were attached to a sledge and then were dragged by horses through the streets of London. Crowds saw the decaying bodies of the men, including Cromwell, and they were taken to Tyburn, the infamous site of execution. When they arrived, each of the bodies, including Cromwell's, was taken from the coffin and was then handed to the executioner. This would have been a harrowing sight to see. the former Lord Protector's decaying remains being manhandled and butchered. Cromwell's body was then hanged from the gallows at Tyburn in chains from the morning until about 4 o'clock, with many people coming to witness them hanging. Following this, they were then taken down, and Cromwell's remains were hacked at by an executioner and his axe. It took 8 blows of the axe to sever his head from his body, and after this it was then placed onto a metal spike, a 20-foot oak pole, and this was placed above Westminster Hall. The posthumous execution was done to bring immense shame and horror to the family of Cromwell, and also his legacy. It's not known what happened to his body, and some believe that it was thrown into a pit after his head was hacked from his body, but his daughter Mary may have rescued it from this pit, and then buried the body at Newbury Priory, the home of her husband. Today there is a sealed stone vault which it's believed may contain the remains of the headless Cromwell, but constant requests for this to be opened have been refused. Even the monarchy have asked to confirm whether Cromwell's headless body is there, but it is yet to be proven. But his head then went on a remarkable journey, in which it passed through many people's hands. Cromwell's head stayed on the spike above Westminster Hall until 1684, but at some point the pole broke, which carried the head during a storm, and then fell onto the floor. After this, a guard of the Exchequer's office found it and stored it in the chimney of his home. Many in London were looking for Cromwell's head, but then it was owned by a number of people. It passed to a Swiss-French collector of curiosities and objects, who displayed it in his attraction, but after his death the head fell from infamy, and it wasn't as wanted as it previously was. A number of owners paid a significant amount of money for it, and it was displayed again in an exhibition, but this failed. Today it's interred inside a secret location near the antechapel of a Sydney, Sussex college, and it was placed here as Cromwell used to attend this college. It was placed inside an airtight container, and a few people witnessed the interment, and the burial was very secret. There were further rumours about Cromwell's body and the remains after his posthumous execution. One was that he was buried at the battlefield of Naseby, the site of one of his greatest victories. Another claimed that the coffin was sunk into the deepest part of the River Thames on the night after Cromwell's death, but to the worry of royalists getting their hands on his remains, it was said it was consulted how to dispose of his corpse, that they could not pretend to keep it for the pomp of a public burial, and to prevent it falling into barbarous hands, it was restored to wrap it in a lead, to put it aboard a barge, and to sink it in the deepest part of the Thames, which was done the night following Cromwell's death. Samuel Pepys also wrote that he heard a story that Cromwell did in his life transpose many of the bodies of the kings of England from one grave to another, and by that means it's not known certainly whether the head that is now set upon the post be that of Cromwell or one of the kings. Pepys's idea means that he may have replaced his body in the coffin of Westminster with the king's, and he may have believed his remains would be abused after his death. Other historians questioned that his body was switched out before its posthumous execution, and one believed that the man whose job it was to exhume the bodies found the tombs of Cromwell and Puritan to in fact be empty. So instead 2 other graves were exhumed and dug up. But the posthumous execution of Oliver Cromwell was savage and brutal. If you were to witness the events that day, it would have been terrifying, as the remains of the Lord Protector and the man who ordered the execution of the king were dragged throughout London to Tyburn. There they were hanged in chains and were beheaded, and this would have been a shocking sight. It showed the displeasure and hatred that the king, Charles II, had for those who had ordered his father's execution and death, and made him a rather fearsome monarch in his own right. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.